last little minute it took us to get ready. We're excited to have you for this fourth session of the 8th Annual International Conference on Sustainable Development. I'm going to ask our moderator, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, to also come on and connect his camera and microphone so that he can introduce our keynote speaker. We'll give Jeff just a second. Oh, I thought we had him. Maybe he got disconnected for a moment. Please bear with us. We'll be just another second. We'll be back with you, everybody. All right. Jeff, I think maybe it should work now. Sorry you had so much trouble.
Wow.
Apologies. Great. Wonderful to have you with us. Looking forward to starting the session.
Thank you. Are we ready to start? Thank you. Oh, I made it in the last moment, frantically trying to enter the conference. Thanks to everybody that is in the plenary, and especially thanks to the IMF Deputy Managing Director, Dr. Tao Zhang, a wonderful global leader of international finance. Let me give a brief introduction of Dr. Zhang, if I may. He's been Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund since August 2016. He has a huge portfolio inside the IMF on many key and emerging issues that we're going to be speaking about, including the evolution of the international financial system, digital currencies, climate change, and 90 countries that are also under his direct supervision. He is profoundly experienced as a policymaker in China at the People's Bank of China as deputy governor, and with important stints at many international organizations, the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and of course the IMF, also as an executive director for China. What's also extremely notable, and for our time so important, he's also an electrical engineer from Tsinghua University. So that's a great combo when we're trying to deal with climate change and how to finance the energy transition. So let me thank you for being with us. We're really delighted, and we're looking forward to your talk right now, and then you and I will have a discussion soon afterwards, and we'll invite questions from the listeners as well. So it's over to you, Dr. Zhang. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff, for those very nice words. And thank you for inviting me to join this great event. And it's my pleasure to join all of us, the audience, in these opportunities to share some of the thoughts in this important subject of the sustainable development. As all of you are aware, we are currently in the midst of a crisis like no other. This pandemic has sent shockwaves through the global economy. People are worried about their lives and livelihoods. Many businesses are either closed or waiting for customers to return. Governments are stretching their spending capacities, and the financial stability is threatened around the world. So as a result, the policymakers are looking for ways to contain the spread of the virus while limiting the economic fallout. So as you can see, it's a daunting challenges. And this is a true global crisis. The COVID-19 virus does not stop at the borders. For this particular reasons, coordinated international strategies to fight the virus and its economic impact are more effective than just going it alone. That's a lessons learned number one. So it is now time for global cooperations and multilateral coordinations. Yet this has been slow to happen. It took 2 global devastating wars for international communities to see the value of the multilateral system. But support for multilateralism has been weakening for several years now. And some feel that this trend has accelerated during this crisis. So in the next few minutes, I just want to highlight 2 areas as example where we desperately needed multilateral solutions. And then I'll move to some broad ideas how to strengthen the dynamism of multilateralism. So let me start by drawing your attention first to the challenges faced by particularly developing economies, or in other words, the poorer nations. So these countries have been hit hard by pandemic. For example, from severe domestic economic contractions triggered by the virus and the lockdown measures imposed to contain it. And another example is from the perfect storm of external shocks, including falling export, sharp capital outflows, lower receipts from remittances, and lower tourism earnings, you name it. So at the same time, government in developing countries have very limited resources to respond to the crisis. Let me just give you a few numbers. For example, the advanced economies boosted fiscal spendings by almost 9 percentage points of their GDP. And emerging economies boosted their spending by 4 percentage points. And you can imagine how much the developing country can do. Actually, they, on average, were able to make only 2 percentage points of GDP available. So you can see that this is a simply not enough to cover their immediate need. In the absence of an adequate policy response, lasting damages to developing countries is very much likely. This would make achieving the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals even more difficult. And this is difficult already, even before the crisis. As you know that achieving the SDGs would have required a major scaling up of the international assistance. But to be sure, national governments certainly have their part to play in terms of the raising taxes efficiently and use it more equally, and also allocating spending more appropriately. At the same time, bilateral donors also will need to step up their assistance. Other actors, including civil society, the private sectors, will need to get involved even more actively. But what I want to say is the multilateral institutions have a key role as well. For example, in project financings and in helping countries to meet their international liquidity needs. And some countries, when they emerge from the crisis, they may also need to restructure their debt. And this, in the past, has involved tremendous assistance from the multilateral bodies, such as the Paris Club. Now, let me turn into the second areas where more multilateral cooperation is greatly needed at this time, which is obviously the climate change. countries have a great deal of work to do in terms of the adaptations, which is to make the kind of investment and changes to economic process that will be needed to adapt to the changing climate. And there's certainly an element of multilateral cooperation needed here, as many poorer countries will need advice and financial assistance from the rest of the world. But another important multilateral assistance from the rest of which we talk about is the mitigations. That is how to change our behavior collectively in order to slow or stop climate change. Fortunately, there's already a multilateral process to deal with climate change. For example, the annual United Nations Climate Change Conferences, which is also called COP, COP meetings. And the world is now gearing up for the pivotal COP26 meetings in 2021, where all of us will be revisiting the country's climate change strategies. Clearly, of course, the more need and must to be done. For example, current mitigation pledges fell well short of what is needed to meet the Paris Agreement's objectives of limiting global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. Global carbon prices average just $2 per ton, and they likely need to get up to 75 per ton, according to some recent analysis. Acting unilaterally, as someone argued, that countries do not have enough incentives to scale up their mitigation effort. So one possible solution is the concept of international carbon price floor. If, for example, major shareholders would simultaneously implement a minimum carbon price within their jurisdictions, this would cover about 70% of global emissions reductions opportunities, while providing reassurances about potential losses in the competitiveness from carbon pricing. As people argued, such a arrangement could be designed equitably with stricter requirements for advanced economies and flexibly to accommodate different policy approaches at national levels, considering their country-specific circumstances. And as discussed in our Fiscal Monitor's report issued in 2019, even very modest levels of the carbon pricings could have a very strong impact in terms of the scaling up the global mitigations. So how do we deliver? Then I would like to talk about how to restore the dynamism of the multilateralism. So we sure have to restore the dynamism of the multilateralism, and that is so desperately needed in many areas, including the areas I just talked about. Obviously, we don't have a magic recipe, I'm afraid, but there are a very few important points come to my mind. First, we, the multilateral organizations, need to up our game. We have to be nimble, responding quickly to the fast changing landscape, and we have to be innovative in that process. I'm proud that the IMF has been a strong partner for countries, including in this initial stage of the COVID-19 crisis. We have provided more financing and to a greater number of the membership, more than any other time in the histories of our institutions. We have led the call for debt relief together with the World Bank for the poorest countries, which, as you know, was adopted by the G20 early this year. We have continued to provide policy advice and technical assistance, and we have done all of this while working from home. We have also been bold, I think, in devoting substantial resources to issues of climate change, inequalities, gender, governance, social spending, fintech, among others, which is beyond our traditional areas of the financial stabilities and economic growth. We have realized over the past few years that we just can't adequately fulfill our core mandate of ensuring global macroeconomic stabilities if we ignore all of these critical issues that countries are grappling with. So without a doubt, there is much more that we can do. And the same is true to other international organizations which also have stepped up, but needed to go further. If we can't show the world that its multilateral organizations are highly effective, our cause for enhanced multilateralism will surely ring hollow. Second point, we also need to acknowledge that multilateralism is bigger than just the international organizations, which of course charged with its stewardship. In particular, we need to forge new partnerships to bring in other players, including private investors, academia, and civil societies. Today's session is a perfect example when I accept the invitation from Professor Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University. Consider, for example, the concept behind the compact with Africa. I just using these as examples. This is a G20-led initiative a few years back aimed at closing infrastructure gaps and boosting private investment. So if successful, this initiative can serve as a template for bringing and leveraging the creativities and productivities of the private sectors. We should expand such initiatives and also leverage corporate efforts to promote good governance as well as corporate social responsibilities. Third, the point I would think is we need to do a better job in terms of advocating and make clear just how much the world has to lose if we allow multilateralism to wither. Globalization, as we've seen it, has been a major driver of income growth and indeed human development over the past several decades, which lifts countless millions of people out of poverty. So it's a huge achievement. However, at the same time, some of its downsides, including, for example, rising inequalities had already become apparent even before this pandemic crisis. And the crisis this time had only revealed additional downside downside of our interconnectedness. But severing connections between people and between businesses may lead us to the wrong outcomes. A better solution, as we think, is to recommit ourselves to openness, to international cooperations, and at the same time to acknowledge the downside, but redouble our effort to address them. Among other things, I think we need to protect, in particular, labor and environmental standards. We must ensure that international tax regimes help to prevent the base erosions and profit shifting. And we need to address the complicated issues related to trade in digital services and the flow of data across the border. All of these can happen only if the countries cooperate with each other and to work with each other on those important building blocks for our future prosperity. So let me conclude by saying that we can reinvigorate multilateralism. We will need to be innovative. We will need to reach out to new partners. We will need to re-engage and build trust across the board. If we can pull together and generate renewed momentum in the areas such as we talk about in the development and climate change, we can reignite enthusiasm for multilateralism and all it has to offer. So in that sense, I look forward to your help, your support, and your ideas. With that, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I know everyone listening around the world was extremely interested and very gratified by your remarks and the leadership of the IMF at this moment. I'd like to ask you a number of issues, about a number of issues that you touched on. The first is about the emergency financing for developing countries. First, I think people should know how creative the IMF has been, because it opened an emergency financing window, and my understanding is that 80 countries were availed by that for around $87 billion. And there would be no way to raise emergency development aid, for example, at that level. So this is very vital liquidity. But as you noted, it's only a small amount relative to what's needed. And it's notable that for the high-income countries, the deficit financing has been in the trillions, and your numbers were very telling, 9% for the advanced countries, and then for the poor countries, 2% of GDP at a much lower base. So my first question is about emergency financing, whether there can be larger amounts possible. There has been continued talk since the start of the crisis about an SDR allocation, for example. And my understanding, it may be incorrect, is that the United States stood against that, but most of the world was for it. And I wonder where this initiative stands right now. And maybe you could explain a little bit to listeners what an SDR allocation actually would mean, and what the state of the debate is. And then related to that, I'll ask you two questions about the financing issue. is there any scope for somehow systematic restructuring of debts of poorer countries? And what I have in mind is that we're going to need restructuring probably for a couple dozen countries or more at least. And this is a very arduous procedure usually. But there's one heartening fact about the international scene right now, and that is that interest rates are extremely low. And so the solution for Argentina recently, which is a good solution, is that their debt was basically refinanced at a low interest rate. And I wonder if there's some way that anybody is thinking about generally refinancing the debts of the low-income countries at very low interest rates and extended maturities, but perhaps not case by case, but in some general principled restructuring, given the number of countries that are systemically affected. So that's a long question, but it all comes down to the question, how can we increase financing for the poor countries right now, given their extreme situation?
Thank you, Jeff. I know this is a very good question, and at the same time, it is a challenging question, and it covers a wide range of the aspect concerning the how to finance the recoveries, financing the development even after the recoveries. And let me start with what you asked at the very beginning, the emergency financing facilities. This is quite specific to our, let's say, toolkit. As you know, we starting in March and April, we mobilized all of our toolkits to provide as much as we can. One of the things is emergency financings. But back to April, we doubled the access limit of the emergency facilities. Now people are thinking of even increase even more. Beyond just the double the access limit, and we also strengthen what we call a facility called the CCRT, which is the catastrophe containment, I forgot the word here, the CCRT, basically the facilities. Which is a trust which will allow us to provide debt relief to the poorest nations. And we not only provide to a larger number of the countries, but also including the access amount. So that's what in terms of the emergence financing facilities, but of course, as you know, we do this together with all other partners. And obviously, our resources by just provided by us itself is not enough. So this is on emergency financings. And the idea using SDR to strengthen the poorest countries' balance sheet has been discussed on the tables. Start from very beginnings since the crisis started. As you know, we are not yet until now at reached to the stage where the the consensus has been reached to use the newly allocated SDRs. Even the IMF has provided the newly allocated SDR before. One of the examples, the recent examples, is in 10 years ago. In a global financial crisis. And but obviously this time there are some concerns on, because the mechanism, the framework to allocate the new SDR is based on the quota. And normally the poor countries, they don't have large enough quotas to get the larger part of the share of the pies when you have a newly allocated the SDR. But on the other hand, as some people argued, for those countries get the newly allocated SDR, it is a simple and straightforward case to strengthen their, the balance of payment positions. And so then that's come out with the idea of what about using existing SDRs, basically pledge those rich countries with more than adequate SDR holdings to transfer to the poor nations, so that without allocating new SDR, then we can still provide some support to poor countries. But of course, the mechanism behind it is more complicated than just reallocate the SDR from one party to the other. But all of these options right now, I think still put it on the table. People don't have, like I said, they don't have a consensus. But I think at the same time, we are explore together with others all the possible solutions, like the emergencies facilities, like the through our new existing the facilities like PRGTs, even the GRAs, which is our normal facility windows to support as much as we can, and including, which I come to, as you mentioned, the debt issues. As we know, we, together with the World Bank, call for debt relief for the poorest countries, which later on G20 adopted and extend the debt services for 1 year, and right now possibly extend it for another years. And people are also exploring whether or not we can do more, even beyond just the debt service suspension. And in terms of the debt restructurings, this is not only concern the poorest nations, as you mentioned, but also the emerging economies such as Argentina and others. And of course, there is a positive development in the Argentina case, taking advantage of the lower interest environment. And whether or not going forward is case by case, or we have a more systematic approach, or even the systematic approach is we're talking about market-based approach or more statutory approach. This is not, as you know, this is not a new issue. It has been going on for at least 10 or 20 years. I don't think here we have a consensus, but good thing is, I think led by G20s and Paris Club, we have the platform to discuss it, and I can see more discussion in this respect than before. So it is a positive progress, But I think as you pointed out rightly, that if the interest rate stay low for long as we assumed it, but on the other hand, we always, these things can change if the financial conditions become tightening, even though the monetary policy stance become more accommodative. But for some countries, if the economic fundamentals is not right, the financial conditions could become tightening at any point, and so it would be an adverse impact imposed on these countries. So I think certainly people pay close attention to these developments.
My own discussions with the IMF about this go back 38 years. To 1982 with the Mexico financial crisis, and then trying to find a systematic formula. There was the various mechanisms for debt restructuring proposed, almost always opposed by the United States and Wall Street, but really important, and it's going to be important again this time. Let me ask you about climate change, if I might. The IMF's one of its great strengths is that you have consultations with every finance minister in the world every year under Article 4. And one of the principles of government, which people should know, is that the finance ministers really hold a lot of power because they have to determine the allocation of spending within countries. Is there a way to use the Article 4 consultations, your annual consultation, to discuss climate change systematically with governments and even have some pages in these Article 4 reports about the state of climate change? Because it's probably the most systematic annual review of fiscal priorities of any mechanism in the world. It engages the entire world. And this is a global crisis. So I wonder whether it would be possible to use the Article 4 process, the global detailed discussion with finance ministers, to get them on board so that they understand this issue better.
Sure. Let's say in terms of the short-term, long-term. At this moment, at these junctures, I know nations around the world are still fighting with the crisis and try to find a way to get the economic back on track. So what we are doing is make sure they do the right things to achieve, which is the sort of the due target containing the pandemic, and promote the growth in a way to keep the jobs, make sure those most vulnerable groups being protected, and so on. And in that respect, we, for the first couple of months since the crisis, we suspend our Article 4, the regular Article 4 consultations, but only gradually resumed starting from the summer. So as we're moving forward, certainly this climate change will be more integrated into our operations. This certainly applied to surveillance, as well as our technical assistance, capacity building effort, and the financial assistance operations. You mentioned, Jeffrey, on the Article 4 surveillance. I'm sure this element will be integrated, but now already we put it into several country cases on the pilot basis.
Oh, good.
And so far, it's quite well received by the authorities, and we are gaining the experience and try to draw best practices to apply to different countries. As you know, in these areas, there are some commonalities in terms of the adaptations, but they do, some countries, particularly those small island economies, probably more receptive to the climate change. And in terms of the mitigations, there are countries are more, the energy-based, they are compared with others. So these are, we have to take into the country's specific circumstances into account. So it is not a one size fits all solutions, but bottom line is, yes, we're moving to integrate the climate change issues into our surveillance work. This is not only Article 4, but also the multilateral surveillance, which is most reflected in our 3 flagship report. As you can see, what we are already, this issue has been covered widely in this flagship report, WHEEL, GFSR, and fiscal monitors. And just next month, we will have a new WHEEL coming out. There, they will have extensive coverage on this issue as well.
Excellent. Oh, that's very, very heartening to hear. And I think we have time for maybe one more question, and I'm going to ask a small one about the future of the international monetary system. Actually, what I'd like to know, right now, the dollar continues to reign supreme in the international system, yet the size of the U.S. economy in the global scheme of things is diminishing as China and other countries become larger and larger as a share of the world economy. Will we move to a multi-currency payment system? Will the renminbi become another core international payments currency, or will we move to an SDR-based system where we have a global currency clearing? I'm rather unhappy with the role of the dollar in some ways right now, because it's also been politicized. You can't use dollars if the US government says you can't use dollars in one country or another country in unilateral sanctions. So how do you see this evolution taking shape in terms of the future discussion that's going on right now?
Yes, that's an excellent question as well. As you know, we at the IMF, of course, had the mandate to make sure the international monetary systems, more stable, stay stable. So international monetary and economic stability is our utmost concern. Sure, dollar right now still a dominant international currencies, reserve currencies in both market transactions, international reserves, and so forth. So, what we are doing is make sure the stabilities will be there. Understandably, as we talk about the economy around the world become more integrated, and more trade is coming out, which we believe that's the right thing to do. And of course, with the new technologies coming into play, digital services, someone called digital trade, or digital economy at large, this is also a push for a changing or challenging, if you want, impact on the payment system, etc. Whether or not this is coming from currencies or sovereign currencies other than US dollars, or it is coming from the private sectors, as people talk about the stable currencies, whether or not the stable currencies will be used for international transaction purposes, or just stay within their own jurisdictions, as some of them are, experimenting with the central bank digital currencies. All of these will have a strong impact on the systems. So if we're talking about the prospect into the futures, so we have to keep very close attention to these new developments and make sure these developments will not, jeopardize the global financial stabilities. And you mentioned the RMBs. I believe as Chinese economies become more integrated into the world economies, as China's economy is growing larger, certainly the role of Chinese economies, played in the global economy will become larger. And as the market developed, whether or not their currencies, particularly the RMB, will become more, let's say, internationally accepted, I think is driven by these market forces. And of course, there's a lot of work need to be done in terms of the reforms, both inside China, and also how to make sure our, the global system remains open, remains rule-based, remains more transparent. All of these forces will come into play to make sure or ensure the global stabilities will be there. So that's what we are looking at it. But of course, we have to pay attention to what is what is happening on the ground, and certainly I think not just IMF, but both the authorities, the other stakeholders, national authorities, and private sectors, they are all working on it.
Let me thank you very much for those deep insights. And I just want to share in closing a thought. When I started in economics a long time ago, it was actually 48 years ago that I started to study economics in the early 1970s. The first monetary system that the IMF oversaw, the so-called Bretton Woods system with the dollar at the center of a fixed exchange rate system, had just collapsed in August 1971. And I remember as I was studying, articles were written that the IMF should be closed down, its use doesn't exist anymore, and there were complaints that the bureaucracy was trying to reinvent itself for new purposes, only to keep a job. And I think if you look 45 years later at such statements, how silly they are. It's so important that we have a strong international monetary fund that functions properly and precisely changes over time as the real circumstances in the world change, because what doesn't change is the need for global cooperation. What doesn't change is the need for a system. What doesn't change is the need for rules, transparency, fairness, and help for poor countries. That's been constant from the start. But the way to do this, whether it's in COVID or climate change or digital currency, that does change over time. So I just want to thank you for being in the forefront of thinking through new solutions that are needed right now, and tell you you have strong support for the creativity that you're showing. And as you go into your annual meetings coming up, we really want to see that dynamism and the leadership in the multilateral system. So with that, I want to thank you so much for sharing your invaluable time. And I'm sure that everybody listening was really very deeply informed. And on behalf of everybody, I want to say a great thank you to you.
Thank you. I agree 100% with you, Jeff. And I also very much hope to continue our process in terms of supporting the multilateralism, and so that the world, we will have the opportunities to continue to work together and move forward.
Wonderful. Take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you next. Bye-bye.